Welcome to History Teller YT, where we bring the past to life, uncover hidden stories, and explore the moments that shaped our world. Today, we take a journey into one of the most intense, tragic, and defining conflicts of the 20th century, the Spanish Civil War. From 1936 to 1939, Spain became a battlefield for ideologies, a testing ground for new military tactics, and a stage for human courage and suffering that resonates to this day. Fascism clashed with communism. Hitler and Mussolini tested their weapons, and artists like Pablo Picasso captured the horror of war in masterpieces like Guernica. In this full-length history, we'll explore every turning point, from the rise of Franco and the Republican resistance, to the battles that shook cities, the mass displacement of civilians, and the ultimate collapse of the Republic. We'll witness the strategies, struggles, and sacrifices that defined a nation on the brink. Stay with us as we unravel the Spanish Civil War in 20 detailed chapters, giving you the story as it truly happened, connecting battles, politics, and the human experiences that made this war unforgettable. This is more than history. It's the story of Spain's fight, its triumphs and tragedies, and the lessons the world still remembers today. Let's begin. By the mid-1930s, Spain was a nation teetering on the precipice of chaos. The country had endured decades of political instability, social unrest, and economic struggles. Deep divisions between the conservative monarchy, the landed aristocracy, and the military on one side, and the rising influence of leftist, socialist, and anarchist movements on the other, created an environment ripe for conflict. The dictatorship of Miguel Primo de Rivera had ended in 1930, leaving a fragile democratic government, but the country was still divided. Agriculture dominated the economy, but the majority of land was owned by a few wealthy families, leaving peasants in extreme poverty. Urban areas were no less turbulent. Industrial workers faced low wages and dangerous working conditions, while intellectuals and artists debated fiercely over Spain's identity. In 1931, the proclamation of the Second Spanish Republic promised change. New reforms aimed at reducing inequality, including land redistribution and secularizing education, angered conservatives and the church. The military, which had long been a pillar of traditional power, felt threatened by the sweeping changes, and regional tensions in Catalonia and the Basque Country added another layer of complexity. Radical political factions emerged across the spectrum. The left included the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party, PSOE, the Communist Party of Spain, and anarchist organizations like the CNT, which sought to radically transform society. On the right, monarchists, fascist sympathizers, and conservative Catholics coalesced in opposition. Political violence became increasingly common, with street clashes, assassinations, and sabotage becoming daily occurrences in major cities. Spain in the early 1930s was not just divided. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark came in July 1936, when a faction of the military, led by General Francisco Franco and other nationalist leaders, attempted a coup against the Republican government, plunging the nation into a civil war that would last 3 brutal years. The attempted military coup of July 17, 1936, was designed to be swift and decisive, but it quickly unraveled into a full-blown civil war. While the coup succeeded in some regions, it failed in others, creating a bloody stalemate that divided Spain geographically and ideologically. The nationalists, led by Franco, represented conservative, monarchist, and fascist elements, while the Republicans were a coalition of leftists, anarchists, and supporters of the Spanish Republic. Initial battles were chaotic. Madrid, the capital, remained largely in Republican hands, becoming a symbol of resistance. In contrast, Large portions of northern and western Spain fell under nationalist control, consolidating their power and creating a front line that would define much of the war. Both sides committed atrocities, with political assassinations, mass executions, and terror tactics becoming common. The Republicans, despite their internal divisions, relied on militias and volunteers, while the Nationalists benefited from a more unified military command and substantial support from conservative institutions, including the Catholic Church. Propaganda played a crucial role from the very beginning. Newspapers, pamphlets, and radio broadcasts fueled ideological fervor, demonizing opponents and rallying support. The war quickly became not only a struggle for Spain's future, but also a battleground for competing visions of society: democracy, socialism, and anarchism versus authoritarianism, militarism, and fascism. The early months were particularly critical, as both sides scrambled to secure weapons, form alliances, and consolidate their territories. The conflict's brutality shocked the world, with reports of massacres, summary executions, and widespread repression drawing international attention. Many observers recognized that Spain was not simply fighting a civil war. It was on the cusp of becoming a testing ground for the ideologies that would soon engulf Europe in World War II. As the war escalated, Spain became a magnet for foreign interest and intervention. Fascist Italy under Mussolini and Nazi Germany under Hitler saw the conflict as an opportunity to test military tactics, equipment, and ideological influence. Germany provided aircraft, tanks, and advisors to the nationalists, using the war as a laboratory for modern warfare. Italy sent thousands of troops and material support, eager to bolster the fascist cause. On the Republican side, support came from the Soviet Union, which supplied weapons, tanks, and military advisors, while the international brigades, volunteers from across the world, arrived to fight against fascism. Intellectuals, journalists, and artists, including George Orwell, Ernest Hemingway, and Pablo Picasso, turned their attention to Spain, documenting the conflict and expressing solidarity. Picasso's Guernica, painted in 1937, became a symbol of the horrors of war, inspired by the nationalist bombing of the Basque town of Guernica, which targeted civilians indiscriminately. The Spanish Civil War was no longer a domestic struggle. It was a stage for the ideological confrontation between fascism and communism that foreshadowed the global conflict to come. Reports of air raids, trench warfare, and street battles shocked Europe, making Spain a focal point of debate, diplomacy, and intervention. As both sides sought to win not only militarily, but also morally and politically, the stage was set for a prolonged, devastating struggle that would leave the country scarred and the world watching closely. After the initial coup in July 1936, the nationalist forces quickly moved to consolidate power across key regions. Franco and his fellow generals understood that rapid territorial control was crucial. They leveraged their superior military organization, existing networks within the army, and support from conservative factions, including wealthy landowners and the Catholic Church. The nationalist strategy was clear: secure northern and western Spain, establish strongholds, and cut Republican forces into isolated pockets. Cities like Seville, Zaragoza, and Burgos fell swiftly to the nationalists. In Seville, for instance, the city was captured with the support of local right-wing militias who carried out brutal purges of suspected Republicans and leftists. The nationalists' approach combined conventional military tactics with terror to intimidate the population and eliminate resistance. Franco himself, a relatively unknown figure before the war, emerged as the de facto leader, demonstrating a rare combination of political acumen and ruthlessness. Meanwhile, the nationalist propaganda machine sought to portray the war as a moral crusade against communism, anarchism, and moral decay. Posters, pamphlets, and radio broadcasts emphasized religious symbolism, painting the nationalists as defenders of Christian Spain and civilization itself. In rural areas, landowners and conservative groups rallied behind Franco, providing resources and intelligence to the nationalist military. Their support was crucial, as the countryside provided not only manpower, but also food supplies and shelter for the advancing armies. By the end of 1936, the nationalists had established a network of controlled territories connected by fortified positions, railways, and roads, giving them a strategic advantage. Despite the Republican government's resilience in urban centers like Madrid, Valencia, and Barcelona, the nationalists' disciplined and organized approach allowed them to maintain momentum, setting the stage for a protracted and bloody struggle that would define Spain for the next 3 years. The Republican side, though ideologically committed to defending the Second Spanish Republic, faced enormous challenges. Unlike the nationalists, they were a coalition of anarchists, socialists, communists, and liberal Republicans, groups that often disagreed sharply on tactics, ideology, and the ultimate vision for Spain. Militias formed spontaneously across urban centers, consisting of workers, students, and volunteers with varying degrees of military training. While their enthusiasm and commitment were unquestionable, this lack of cohesion created operational difficulties. In Barcelona, for example, anarchist militias from the CNT, Confederación Nacional del Trabajo, operated semi-independently, prioritizing revolutionary social reform alongside military objectives. Similarly, the PSOE and Communist Party units often clashed over strategy, resource allocation, and political leadership. Madrid became the Republican stronghold, a symbol of determination and resilience. The city's defense relied heavily on mobilizing ordinary citizens into militias, establishing barricades, and fortifying key neighborhoods. Though poorly equipped compared to nationalist forces, these militias fought fiercely, utilizing guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and close-quarter combat to slow the nationalist advance. The Republicans also sought international support, appealing to the Soviet Union for arms, advisors, and training. Soviet involvement, however, came with strings attached, as the USSR attempted to exert influence over Republican decision-making, creating further tensions among factions. The conflict in Republican territories was as much about ideology as survival. Debates over collectivization, labor reform, and social revolution took place even while bullets flew in the streets. These internal divisions sometimes weakened the Republican war effort, yet they also fostered a sense of revolutionary zeal that inspired volunteers from abroad and captured the imagination of international observers. As Spain descended further into civil war, the international dimension became increasingly significant. Thousands of volunteers from across the globe traveled to Spain to join the fight against fascism. These men and women, known collectively as the International Brigades, came from countries like France, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Canada. Driven by ideological commitment, many saw the Spanish Civil War as the front line in the global struggle against fascism, a test of moral courage in the face of rising authoritarian regimes in Europe. The brigades were often poorly equipped, trained, and supplied, but compensated with unwavering dedication and bravery. Figures such as George Orwell joined Republican forces, chronicling the war's brutality and political complexities, which he later reflected in works like Homage to Catalonia. On the nationalist side, Hitler and Mussolini saw Spain as an opportunity to refine modern warfare tactics. The Luftwaffe's Condor Legion conducted aerial bombings, reconnaissance, and experimental maneuvers that would later be employed in World War II. Italy sent thousands of troops and tanks to support Franco, testing their weapons in real combat conditions. The Republican government, meanwhile, relied heavily on Soviet support, receiving tanks, aircraft, and advisors. However, this aid was often accompanied by political interference, causing friction with anarchist and socialist factions. The war thus became a crucible of international politics, where Spanish soil became the testing ground for ideologies and military technologies that would soon engulf the world. The participation of foreign forces highlighted the broader significance of the Spanish Civil War. It was no longer just a domestic conflict, but a prelude to the global clash of fascism, communism, and democracy that would define the mid-20th century. By late 1936, Madrid, the heart of the Republic, became the focal point of the Spanish Civil War. The nationalists, having secured key cities in southern and western Spain, turned their attention to the capital, believing that capturing it would effectively end Republican resistance. Franco's strategy combined relentless military pressure with psychological warfare aimed at breaking the morale of the city's defenders. The nationalist forces, numbering tens of thousands and supported by Italian troops and German advisors, advanced steadily toward Madrid, employing artillery bombardments, aerial strikes, and encirclement tactics. Republican forces, on the other hand, were a mix of militias, regular army units loyal to the Republic, and international brigade volunteers, all defending a city that was ill-prepared for prolonged siege warfare. Streets became trenches, public buildings were fortified, and every available civilian was mobilized to support the defense. Madrid's citizens were drawn into the war effort, digging fortifications, manning barricades, and caring for the wounded. The city became a symbol of Republican resolve and revolutionary spirit. Despite shortages of food, ammunition, and medical supplies, the defenders resisted repeated nationalist assaults. Propaganda played a crucial role on both sides, with Republican newspapers and radio broadcasts portraying Madrid as the last bastion of democracy and social justice, while nationalist outlets framed their offensive as a righteous crusade to save Spain from chaos. The battle was not only military, but also symbolic. The outcome would signal the strength and viability of the Republic in the eyes of the world. The first months of the siege were marked by intense urban combat, where snipers, artillery, and street-to-street fighting inflicted heavy casualties on both sides. Madrid's defenders adapted quickly, turning ordinary streets and neighborhoods into strategic defensive positions, demonstrating that determination and ingenuity could offset disparities in training and equipment. As the battle for Madrid intensified, civilians bore the brunt of the conflict. Air raids by the nationalist Condor Legion targeted not just military positions, but residential areas, seeking to terrorize the population and undermine Republican morale. Families huddled in basements and shelters, struggling to survive amid constant bombardment. Food shortages and the collapse of public services exacerbated the suffering, while hospitals overflowed with casualties. Children, women, and the elderly became involuntary participants in a war not of their making. Yet, amidst the horror, acts of courage and solidarity emerged. Neighborhood committees organized food distribution, amateur medics tended to the wounded, and local residents helped fortify streets and buildings against advancing nationalist forces. The psychological toll was immense. Constant fear, grief over lost loved ones, and the pervasive uncertainty of survival created a tense, almost apocalyptic atmosphere. Meanwhile, Republican authorities attempted to maintain a sense of normalcy through cultural and political activities, organizing lectures, rallies, and even theater performances to keep morale high. propaganda campaigns emphasized civic duty, revolutionary spirit, and resistance against fascism, reinforcing the notion that every citizen was a soldier in the fight for the Republic. This intersection of military struggle and civilian life highlighted a tragic truth of the Spanish Civil War. The front lines were not confined to battlefields, but permeated homes, schools, and workplaces. Madrid became both a fortress and a crucible, testing the resilience, courage, and endurance of its citizens. The Siege of Madrid attracted international attention like no other moment in the Spanish Civil War. Photographers, journalists, and writers arrived from across Europe and the Americas to document the unfolding drama. George Orwell, Ernest Hemingway, and numerous others provided first-hand accounts of the city under siege, conveying both the heroism of defenders and the horrors inflicted upon civilians. Propaganda, meanwhile, became a weapon as potent as guns and artillery. Republican propaganda portrayed Madrid as a city of resistance, a living embodiment of democracy and social progress threatened by fascist aggression. Posters, pamphlets, and radio broadcasts urged citizens to stand firm, glorifying militia fighters and revolutionary volunteers. Conversely, nationalist propaganda painted the Republicans as anarchists and communists intent on destroying Spain's moral and religious fabric, framing their military campaign as a righteous crusade to restore order. The battle's international dimension also shaped diplomatic responses. Many countries, including Britain, France, and the United States, struggled with their stance on intervention. While some citizens and political groups organized support for the Republican cause, governments maintained official policies of non-intervention, wary of escalating a European conflict. However, the nationalist siege, combined with reports of civilian suffering, made Madrid a global symbol of resistance and injustice. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and illustrated magazines spread stories of bombed neighborhoods, heroic militiamen, and the unwavering spirit of ordinary citizens. This dual role of Madrid as a battlefield and a propaganda stage underscored the Spanish Civil War's complexity. It was as much about ideology, image, and perception as it was about bullets, tanks, and artillery. The siege would continue for months, exacting a terrible human toll and shaping the narrative of the war in Spain and abroad. On April 26, 1937, the Basque town of Guernica became the scene of one of the most infamous atrocities of the Spanish Civil War. Situated in northern Spain, Guernica had symbolic significance as a historic center of Basque culture and autonomy. The nationalist forces, seeking to break the morale of the Republican resistance and test modern aerial bombing tactics, launched a devastating air raid with support from Hitler's Luftwaffe Condor Legion and Mussolini's Italian Aviazione Legionaria. The town was struck with a combination of high-explosive bombs and incendiary devices, targeting civilians, residential areas, and the town's infrastructure. Eyewitness accounts describe chaos and terror. Families were trapped in burning homes. Streets were littered with the dead and wounded, and panic swept through the population. The scale of destruction shocked the world. Unlike traditional battles, the bombing deliberately focused on non-combatants to instill fear and demonstrate the destructive power of modern warfare. While casualty estimates vary, hundreds of civilians were killed, with many more injured or displaced. The attack on Guernica marked a turning point in military history, illustrating how air power could be used not only to defeat armies, but also to terrorize civilian populations. It also symbolized the evolving nature of 20th century conflict, where industrialized nations could deploy mass destruction from the sky, presaging the horrors of World War II. The attack sent ripples through the international community, igniting outrage among intellectuals, journalists, and ordinary citizens. For the Basque people and Republicans across Spain, Guernica became a rallying cry, emblematic of the struggle against fascist oppression and the indiscriminate brutality of modern war. The Spanish Civil War, and particularly events like the bombing of Guernica, became a laboratory for new military technology and strategies. Both the nationalists and Republicans experimented with equipment, tactics, and doctrines that would later be employed on a global scale during World War II. The nationalists' use of German and Italian aircraft demonstrated the devastating efficiency of air raids, dive bombing techniques, and aerial coordination with ground forces. German pilots tested the accuracy of dive bombers, the timing of coordinated strikes, and the psychological impact of sustained aerial terror. Italy's contribution included mechanized units, armored vehicles, and artillery, giving the nationalists a critical edge in mobile warfare. On the Republican side, the conflict exposed vulnerabilities in logistics, command, and communication, prompting attempts to innovate. Soviets applied tanks, aircraft, and weapons introduced the Republicans to mechanized combat and anti-tank strategies. Militia units improvised guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and urban combat strategies to counter nationalist advantages. The war also highlighted the role of intelligence and espionage, as both sides attempted to infiltrate, sabotage, and gather information about enemy movements. These technological experiments came at enormous human cost, as civilians were often the unintended victims of untested weapons and strategies. Nevertheless, Spain became a proving ground for modern warfare techniques, demonstrating how ideology and technology intertwined in the crucible of conflict. Military observers from across the globe monitored the Spanish Civil War closely, recognizing that lessons learned here would shape the strategies of the next world conflict. From the psychological effects of bombing civilians to the coordination of mechanized units, the war offered grim insight into the destructive potential of modern industrialized combat. The horror of the Guernica bombing transcended the battlefield and found a permanent place in the world of art and consciousness through Pablo Picasso's masterpiece, Guernica. Painted in 1937, the work was a monumental black and white canvas depicting the agony, terror, and chaos inflicted upon civilians by modern warfare. Picasso captured distorted figures, screaming faces, and fractured bodies, conveying both the physical destruction and the emotional trauma of the attack. The painting became an emblem of anti-fascist resistance and the human cost of political and military ambition. Beyond its immediate political message, Guernica highlighted the power of art to bear witness to atrocities, mobilize international awareness, and inspire moral outrage. The painting toured the world, reaching audiences across Europe and the Americas, generating both admiration and controversy. Critics and viewers alike recognized the universality of its message. War inflicted upon civilians was not merely a local tragedy, but a global moral issue. For the people of Spain, Guernica became a symbol of resilience, remembrance, and defiance. The work immortalized the suffering endured during the bombing while challenging the international community to acknowledge the consequences of fascist aggression. In a broader sense, Picasso's Guernica represented the intersection of culture, politics, and warfare, an enduring reminder that human creativity can respond to destruction with profound moral and emotional resonance. The painting remains one of the most powerful testaments to the Spanish Civil War, ensuring that the suffering of Guernica's citizens would never be forgotten. By early 1937, the Republican forces, despite internal divisions and shortages of weapons, launched counteroffensives to regain territory and halt the nationalist advance toward Madrid. After months of fierce urban combat and the intense pressure of siege warfare, Republican leaders recognized that holding the capital required not only tenacity, but strategic initiative. Troops were reorganized into more disciplined units, with the international brigades playing a key role in bolstering numbers and morale. These brigades were composed of volunteers from more than 50 countries, including France, Britain, the United States, Canada, and Latin American nations, all driven by a profound sense of ideological duty. The Republicans focused on defending and reclaiming strategic towns and railway lines that connected Madrid with other Republican strongholds, understanding that control of transport and communication routes was essential for supplies, reinforcements, and a movement of heavy weaponry. Early successes were hard-won and came at immense human cost. Skirmishes in small towns surrounding Madrid were marked by artillery duels, ambushes, and intense hand-to-hand fighting. Civilian populations were caught in the crossfire, with towns often experiencing mass evacuations and shortages of food, medicine, and shelter. Despite these challenges, the counteroffensives showcased the Republicans' ability to adapt to conventional and guerrilla tactics. Coordination between regular army units, militias, and foreign volunteers improved, although ideological differences and political tensions continued to hamper efficiency. Nonetheless, these early counterattacks provided hope for the Republic and demonstrated that nationalist forces, despite their advantages in training, equipment, and foreign support, were not invincible. One of the most critical engagements during the Republican counteroffensives was the Battle of Jarama, fought in February 1937. Located southeast of Madrid, the Jarama River Valley was a strategic point, as controlling it would prevent nationalist forces from encircling the capital and severing crucial supply lines. Republican commanders, including Soviet advisors, orchestrated an offensive aimed at halting the nationalist advance and protecting Madrid's eastern flank. The battle quickly became a grueling and bloody stalemate. Trenches, dugouts, and makeshift fortifications lined the riverbanks, while both sides endured relentless artillery barrages and machine gun fire. International brigades, including the Abraham Lincoln Brigade from the United States, played a pivotal role in frontline combat. Their bravery became legendary, though the cost was staggering. Thousands of soldiers on both sides were killed or wounded within weeks, highlighting the brutal nature of modern warfare, where morale, endurance, and sheer human resilience were as decisive as tactical ingenuity. The nationalists, with superior artillery and air support, pressed the Republicans relentlessly. Meanwhile, the Republicans employed innovative tactics, including counterattacks under cover of darkness and coordinated assaults along multiple axes, attempting to exploit weaknesses in enemy lines. The fighting extended beyond military strategy. It tested the resolve of ordinary citizens, militia leaders, and foreign volunteers alike. The Battle of Jarama demonstrated that the Spanish Civil War was no longer a series of sporadic clashes, but a sustained, industrialized conflict where both sides engaged in attritional warfare that foreshadowed the large-scale battles of World War II. Beyond Madrid and Jarama, control of towns, roads, and terrain became critical to the war's progression. Spain's diverse geography, from the mountains of the north to the plains of Castilla and the rivers threading across the landscape, shaped the strategies of both Republicans and nationalists. Nationalists focused on securing strongholds in northern Spain, particularly in the Basque region and along the northern coast, where industrial resources, ports, and infrastructure could be exploited for the war effort. Republican forces concentrated on urban centers and industrial areas like Valencia, Barcelona, and the Republican-held zones of the north, knowing that maintaining supply chains and communication lines was essential for survival. The nationalists' superior coordination and access to foreign-supplied weapons allowed them to launch focused offensives on strategic towns, often overwhelming Republican militias before they could organize effective resistance. The Republicans, in turn, relied on mobilizing local populations, establishing defensive fortifications, and utilizing intelligence networks to anticipate and disrupt nationalist movements. Both sides understood that the capture or loss of even a single town could have a ripple effect across entire provinces. Control of railway lines, bridges, and highways meant the difference between resupplying a besieged city and leaving it vulnerable to encirclement. The war was not fought solely in pitched battles, but in the continual contest for logistical and territorial advantage. Civilians often found themselves negotiating survival amid shifting front lines, and towns became alternating sites of occupation, evacuation, and devastation. The struggle for these strategic towns exemplified the interplay of military strategy, geography, and human endurance, highlighting that the Spanish Civil War was both a conflict of ideology and a deeply physical struggle for survival across a fractured landscape. The northern Basque region, known for its distinct language, culture, and strong industrial base, became a pivotal front in the Spanish Civil War. The Basque government, loyal to the Republic, faced immense challenges as the nationalists advanced with relentless determination. The region's significance lay not only in its strategic location, but also in its industrial resources, particularly iron, steel, and coal, which were crucial for war production. The nationalists, supported by German and Italian forces, aimed to cut off these resources from the Republican war effort. Bilbao, the largest city in the Basque region, became a symbol of industrial resistance. Republican forces, including local Basque militias and international brigades, fortified the city and surrounding areas, establishing defensive lines along rivers, hills, and urban zones. The Basque militias combined traditional knowledge of the rugged terrain with innovative defensive strategies, constructing barricades, trenches, and improvised fortifications to slow the nationalist advance. Despite their determination, the Basque forces faced a formidable enemy. Franco's troops were well-equipped, disciplined, and reinforced by mechanized Italian units and German aircraft. Air superiority allowed the nationalists to conduct bombing raids, reconnaissance missions, and artillery spotting, weakening defensive positions even before ground assaults began. The psychological impact on civilians was profound. Towns and villages faced the constant threat of aerial bombardment, forcing mass evacuations and disrupting daily life. Yet, Basque nationalism and commitment to the Republican cause fueled resilience. Cultural identity and the desire to protect their homeland became intertwined with military objectives, making the Basque Front both a strategic and symbolic battleground in the Spanish Civil War. By mid-1937, nationalist forces had encircled Bilbao, initiating a prolonged siege. The city's defenders, though determined, were hampered by insufficient supplies, limited heavy weaponry, and the absence of significant external reinforcements. Nationalist artillery bombarded key neighborhoods, industrial complexes, and transportation hubs, aiming to cripple both military and civilian morale. The Luftwaffe's Condor Legion carried out precision bombing missions, testing new tactics and equipment that would later be employed in broader European conflicts. Inside Bilbao, Republican and Basque militia forces resisted fiercely. Street-to-street fighting, trench warfare, and improvised fortifications characterized the defense, while hospitals and makeshift aid stations struggled to cope with the growing number of casualties. Civilians contributed to the war effort, assisting with logistics, digging trenches, and providing food and medical care. Yet, the weight of a nationalist offensive proved overwhelming. Supplies dwindled, ammunition ran low, and the relentless pressure of mechanized attacks and aerial bombardments created a sense of inevitable defeat. On June 19, 1937, Bilbao fell to Franco's forces. The capture of the city marked a major victory for the nationalists, granting them control over the northern industrial heartland of Spain. It also signified the crushing of a key Republican stronghold, demonstrating the effectiveness of coordinated land and air operations, combined with disciplined troop maneuvers and foreign support. The fall of Bilbao had lasting consequences. Thousands of civilians fled, industrial output shifted to nationalist hands, and the Basque region came under authoritarian control, with its autonomy severely curtailed. The nationalist victory in the Basque region was not achieved solely through brute force. Foreign assistance played a decisive role. Germany's Luftwaffe and Italy's air and mechanized units provided the nationalists with technological superiority, enabling effective aerial bombardment, reconnaissance, and coordination with ground troops. Italian tanks and artillery units helped breach fortified positions, while German aircraft disrupted Republican supply lines and communications. This foreign involvement also served as a testing ground for tactics and equipment that would later define World War II, including precision bombing, coordinated mechanized attacks, and combined arms strategies. Additionally, nationalist control of the northern coastline allowed them to leverage naval superiority. Ships from Spain's nationalist fleet, along with Italian support vessels, controlled key ports and disrupted Republican shipping, limiting the movement of supplies, weapons, and reinforcements. The Republicans, constrained by limited naval resources and international non-intervention policies, struggled to maintain control over critical supply routes. Meanwhile, local populations endured immense hardships. Starvation, displacement, and violence were widespread, and propaganda campaigns emphasized both fear and loyalty. The nationalist consolidation of industrial northern Spain strengthened Franco's war machine, providing resources to fuel subsequent offensives and demonstrating the strategic importance of industrial and naval control in modern warfare. The siege and fall of Bilbao encapsulated the brutal combination of strategy, technology, and ideology that characterized the Spanish Civil War, foreshadowing the larger conflicts and global intervention that would soon engulf Europe. The fall of Bilbao in June 1937 marked the beginning of a broader Republican collapse in northern Spain. The Basque and northern Asturian fronts, once bastions of Republican resistance, faced relentless nationalist offensives reinforced by German and Italian units. Republican forces, already stretched thin, were forced into a strategic withdrawal to avoid encirclement and annihilation. This retreat, while necessary militarily, had devastating consequences for the population and morale. Thousands of civilians fled southward alongside retreating militias and army units, creating waves of refugees struggling to survive under harsh conditions. These refugees carried with them not only the trauma of battle, but also the burden of disrupted communities, loss of property, and a constant fear of nationalist reprisals. Republican commanders faced the difficult task of preserving combat capability while protecting civilians, a balancing act that often proved impossible. Supply lines were precarious, communication networks were disrupted, and the winter of 1937 further compounded the hardships. As nationalist forces advanced, they implemented systematic purges in captured towns, targeting suspected Republicans, union members, and intellectuals. These repressive measures underscored the ruthlessness of Franco's campaign and served to instill fear in regions still resisting nationalist control. Despite these overwhelming challenges, Republican units attempted to regroup, consolidate, and prepare for continued resistance in central and eastern Spain. The northern collapse highlighted the disparity between nationalist and Republican capabilities and exposed the vulnerabilities of a coalition struggling to unite diverse political factions under a single military command. The Republican retreat through northern Spain created a humanitarian crisis on an unprecedented scale. Civilians, including families with young children and the elderly, were forced to flee alongside retreating militias, often with only the clothes on their backs. The journey southward was treacherous. Roads were congested with refugees, food and clean water were scarce, and constant shelling from nationalist artillery threatened both combatants and non-combatants alike. Hospitals and relief efforts were overwhelmed as wounded soldiers and civilians competed for limited medical care. Starvation and disease became rampant, and entire communities were displaced. The psychological toll of this prolonged displacement was immense. Children witnessed death, destruction, and separation from family members, while adults struggled to maintain hope amidst relentless hardship. Yet, amid the despair, acts of solidarity and resilience emerged. Local communities organized makeshift shelters, shared scarce resources, and improvised medical assistance. These efforts, though insufficient to address the scale of suffering, demonstrated the remarkable endurance and courage of ordinary Spaniards during the chaos of war. The northern retreat also underscored a grim reality. The Spanish Civil War was not merely a military struggle, but a social catastrophe, where civilian survival became deeply intertwined with the fortunes of armed forces. Reports from the region reached international media, eliciting sympathy, outrage, and calls for intervention. However, official non-intervention policies by Britain, France, and other powers limited the flow of humanitarian aid and further compounded the suffering of northern Spanish populations. Following the catastrophic losses in the north, Republican leadership recognized the urgent need to reorganize their forces and command structures. The combination of experienced army officers, anarchist militias, socialist battalions, and international volunteers required careful coordination to maximize effectiveness. Soviet advisors played a significant role in restructuring Republican military organization, introducing hierarchical command systems, standardized training, and centralized logistics. This reorganization aimed to transform disparate militias into cohesive brigades capable of sustaining prolonged combat and conducting coordinated operations. One critical focus was the formation of mixed brigades, units that combined ideological loyalty with military efficiency, often integrating local volunteers, international brigade members, and seasoned Republican officers. These brigades were trained in modern warfare techniques, including urban defense, coordinated artillery use, and small unit tactics. Supply chains were overhauled where possible, prioritizing the delivery of weapons, ammunition, and essential provisions to frontline units defending Madrid, Valencia, and other strategic regions. Political commissars were introduced to maintain morale, enforce ideological cohesion, and monitor loyalty within units, particularly as tensions between anarchists, communists, and socialists remained high. The reorganization also emphasized defensive preparations in central Spain, recognizing that nationalist advances were likely to continue. Trenches, barricades, and fortified positions were established along key transportation routes, river crossings, and urban centers. While resource limitations and internal ideological friction persisted, this restructuring allowed the Republican forces to stabilize fronts, maintain some operational capability, and prepare for counteroffensives. The lessons learned from the Northern Retreat. the importance of coordination, discipline, and logistical planning, which shaped the conduct of the Republican Army for the remainder of the war. By early 1937, Franco and the nationalist leadership focused on consolidating power in central Spain with the strategic objective of encircling and eventually capturing Madrid. The Central Plains, known as Castilla, were critical not only for their geographic location, but also for their transportation networks, including railways and highways that connected the north, south, and east of Spain. Nationalist strategy emphasized coordinated offensives combining ground troops, mechanized units, and air support from Italian and German forces. Italy's Corpo Truppe Voluntari played a crucial role, providing both infantry and armor, while German advisors helped organize air raids, reconnaissance, and coordinated artillery strikes. These combined arms operations aimed to overwhelm Republican defenses, exploiting the fragmented command structures and ideological divisions within the Republican Army. The Nationalists understood that capturing key towns and cutting off supply routes could significantly weaken Madrid's defenders, forcing the Republic to stretch its already limited resources. Political objectives were intertwined with military goals. Nationalist propaganda emphasized the necessity of restoring order and Catholic values to Spain, portraying the campaign as both a military and moral crusade. Local conservative populations, often hostile to Republican reforms, provided intelligence, labor, and logistical support, further amplifying nationalist advantages. Meanwhile, Republican forces, still recovering from the northern retreat, scrambled to fortify towns, reorganize militias, and secure lines of communication. The stage was set for a decisive confrontation in the province of Guadalajara, a location that would test both the nationalist advance and the resilience of Republican forces under immense pressure. The Battle of Guadalajara, fought in March 1937, became one of the war's most pivotal engagements. Italian forces, seeking to demonstrate their prowess and support Franco's campaign, advanced toward Guadalajara with mechanized units and well-trained infantry. The nationalist plan relied on speed and coordination to encircle Republican positions, relying on superior equipment and foreign support to overcome resistance. However, Republican forces, bolstered by Spanish regulars and international brigades, mounted a determined defense. The Italians underestimated the Republicans' ability to reorganize, fortify, and adapt to the terrain, which included hills, rivers, and muddy plains that hindered mechanized movement. The battle quickly escalated into intense combat, with artillery duels, counterattacks, and close-quarters engagements. Republican troops utilized guerrilla tactics, exploiting knowledge of the terrain and the vulnerabilities of Italian mechanized units. Reinforcements arrived from Madrid, allowing Republican commanders to stabilize front lines and launch localized counteroffensives. The engagement became a test of endurance, logistics, and morale. The Italians suffered significant losses in both personnel and equipment, while the Republicans demonstrated that determination, tactical innovation, and coordinated defense could repel even technologically superior forces. The victory at Guadalajara boosted Republican morale and provided a propaganda triumph, showcasing that the Republic could resist the combined might of nationalist, Italian, and German forces. The Battle of Guadalajara had far-reaching implications for both the Spanish Civil War and the international perception of the conflict. Militarily, it demonstrated that nationalist advances were not invincible and highlighted the limitations of relying on foreign troops unfamiliar with Spanish terrain and conditions. The defeat forced Franco to re-evaluate his strategy, increasing his reliance on Spanish units and adapting tactics to overcome Republican defensive ingenuity. Politically, the victory energized Republican supporters and serve as a morale boost for international brigades, who had endured grueling conditions and heavy casualties. Journalists and intellectuals across Europe reported the battle, framing it as a symbolic stand against fascist aggression, which in turn attracted additional volunteers and attention to the Republican cause. Italian involvement, though initially intended to cement nationalist superiority, revealed weaknesses in coordination, command, and adaptability, ultimately undermining their early strategic advantage. The battle also emphasized the evolving nature of modern warfare, where mechanized units, combined arms tactics, and air support could decisively influence outcomes, but only if employed with careful planning and understanding of the operational environment. Guadalajara became a turning point, showing that Republican forces, despite internal divisions and resource limitations, could mount effective resistance and inflict significant setbacks on Franco's coalition. The engagement reinforced the war's global significance. Spain was not merely a civil conflict, but a testing ground for modern military strategies, foreign intervention, and the ideological battle that would soon engulf Europe, getting not only military installations, but also civilian populations. Cities like Barcelona, Valencia, and Malaga faced repeated bombings that aimed to disrupt infrastructure, undermine morale, and force strategic withdrawal from key territories. The Condor Legion, in particular, refined techniques in precision bombing, dive bombing, and coordinated strikes with artillery, using Spain as a live laboratory to test new tactics that would later be implemented on a global scale during World War II. Beyond the immediate physical destruction, these bombings carried immense psychological weight. Civilians, aware that entire neighborhoods could be destroyed in a single raid, lived in a constant state of fear. Families sought refuge in basements, underground shelters, and even improvised tunnels, while schools, hospitals, and markets operated under the shadow of potential annihilation. Air raids became a pervasive aspect of daily life, with sirens signaling impending danger and communities adapting routines to survive. The Republican military, lacking sufficient anti-aircraft weaponry and relying on Soviet-supplied aircraft that were often limited in number, struggled to counter these attacks effectively. Nonetheless, Republican pilots and militias devised defensive tactics, including nighttime air patrols, makeshift observation posts, and early warning networks, illustrating both ingenuity and resilience in the face of technologically superior forces. The relentless bombing campaigns forced civilian populations to develop complex survival strategies. In Madrid, families constructed deep shelters and reinforced basements with sandbags and timber to withstand bomb blasts. Neighborhood committees organized shifts for lookouts and air raid warnings, ensuring that residents could take cover promptly. Schools adapted by relocating classes underground or suspending operations entirely, while hospitals faced the dual challenge of treating bombing casualties and maintaining regular healthcare services with limited staff and supplies. Communities also relied on networks of volunteers to deliver food, water, and medical aid under dangerous conditions. These grassroots efforts became essential for survival, highlighting the intersection of civilian resilience and wartime necessity. The psychological impact was equally profound. Children grew up witnessing death and destruction, while adults struggled to maintain morale and a sense of normalcy amidst constant uncertainty. Propaganda campaigns reinforced both fear and solidarity. Republican radio broadcasts encouraged citizens to stand firm for the Republic, framing endurance as a patriotic duty. Conversely, nationalist messaging emphasized the inevitability of Republican defeat, seeking to erode morale and induce surrender. These competing narratives intensified the psychological dimension of warfare, turning cities and towns into not only physical battlegrounds, but also ideological arenas. The adaptation of civilian populations underscored a central reality of the Spanish Civil War. Survival often depended as much on ingenuity, solidarity, and endurance as on military strength or political ideology. The use of air power in Spain demonstrated the profound implications of modern warfare. The Spanish Civil War became a proving ground for techniques that would soon transform global military strategy. The Luftwaffe's precision bombing raids tested the coordination of aircraft, artillery, and ground forces, providing invaluable data on logistics, communication, and the psychological impact of terror tactics. Italian aviation units experimented with mechanized support for infantry, while Republican forces attempted to develop counter-strategies despite limited resources. Beyond tactical lessons, the bombings signaled a moral and political dilemma for the international community. Images of destroyed neighborhoods, traumatized civilians, and smoldering ruins circulated in newspapers and magazines across Europe and the Americas, fueling debates about intervention, neutrality, and the ethics of aerial warfare. Artists, writers, and journalists bore witness to the devastation, ensuring that the human cost of technological experimentation was documented for posterity. The Spanish Civil War thus foreshadowed the horrors of World War II, where civilian populations would increasingly become targets of strategic bombing campaigns. At the same time, the conflict illustrated that human resilience and community organization could mitigate, though never fully eliminate, the suffering caused by industrialized warfare. The aerial campaigns over Spain highlighted both the destructive potential of modern technology and the courage, creativity, and determination of those forced to endure it. In this way, Spain became not only a battlefield, but also a laboratory for understanding the profound transformation of warfare in the 20th century. By the summer of 1937, the Republican leadership recognized the urgent need to regain initiative after months of defensive warfare and territorial losses. While nationalist forces had made significant gains in northern Spain, particularly after the fall of Bilbao, the Republicans sought to relieve pressure on Madrid and boost morale among their forces and civilian supporters. The plan for a summer offensive, focused on the town of Brunit, located just west of Madrid, was ambitious. Republican forces intended to break through nationalist lines, cut supply routes, and force Franco to divert troops from the northern and central fronts. Preparation for the offensive involved careful coordination among various Republican factions, including regular army units, anarchist militias, socialist brigades, and international brigade volunteers. Despite ideological differences, commanders recognized that unified action was essential for success. Soviet advisors provided additional support, offering intelligence, artillery training, and armored vehicles, although this aid sometimes intensified political friction between communist-aligned units and anarchist factions. The offensive also represented a calculated risk. Republican leaders understood that failure could be catastrophic, leading to further territorial loss and weakening morale. Nonetheless, the strategic importance of disrupting nationalist operations and demonstrating the Republic's capacity to mount a coordinated attack outweighed these risks. Troop movements, supply lines, and artillery placements were carefully mapped, with reconnaissance conducted to identify weak points in nationalist defenses. As summer approached, tension grew among both soldiers and civilians, who anticipated the coming battle and its potential to shape the trajectory of the war. The Battle of Brunit, which began in July 1937, became one of the war's largest and bloodiest engagements. Republican forces launched a surprise attack on nationalist positions, advancing rapidly through initially lightly defended areas. Early successes provided a morale boost and demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated offensive tactics, including the integration of artillery, infantry, and armored units. Republican troops captured key positions, disrupted supply routes, and inflicted significant casualties on nationalist forces. However, the initial optimism was tempered by the realities of attritional warfare. Nationalist reinforcements, supported by German and Italian aircraft, counterattacked with brutal efficiency. Aerial bombardments devastated Republican positions, while mechanized units and artillery struck at captured territory, forcing Republican forces into defensive actions. The battle devolved into a prolonged and exhausting engagement, characterized by intense hand-to-hand combat, repeated advances and retreats, and heavy casualties on both sides. Urban and rural terrain alike became zones of destruction. Villages were flattened, roads cratered, and civilians caught in the crossfire endured trauma and displacement. Despite tactical successes, logistical challenges, ammunition shortages, and political friction between factions hampered the Republican Army's ability to consolidate gains. Ultimately, the Nationalists recaptured lost ground, and the offensive failed to achieve its strategic objectives. Nevertheless, the battle demonstrated the Republic's capacity for coordinated action, tested new military tactics, and forced Franco to divert resources to protect central Spain, temporarily relieving pressure on other fronts. The aftermath of the Battle of Brunete had profound implications for the course of the Spanish Civil War. Militarily, the engagement illustrated both the potential and limitations of Republican forces. While they could launch ambitious offensives and inflict meaningful damage on the enemy, the lack of sustained logistics, ideological cohesion, and numerical superiority constrained their ability to translate battlefield gains into long-term strategic advantage. The heavy casualties suffered by Republican units, including international brigades, further strained manpower and morale, creating a need for continuous reorganization and replenishment. Politically, the offensive had mixed effects. On one hand, it demonstrated the Republic's resolve and ability to challenge nationalist dominance, bolstering morale among loyalist populations. On the other hand, the failure to secure lasting gains exposed internal divisions and highlighted the persistent challenges of coordination between communist-aligned units, anarchist militias, and socialist brigades. Civilian populations once again bore the brunt of destruction. Villages and farmland around Brunete were devastated, forcing evacuations and creating humanitarian crises. Strategically, the battle reinforced Franco's reliance on foreign support, particularly from German and Italian forces, while emphasizing the importance of air power, artillery, and mechanized units in determining battlefield outcomes. The engagement at Brunete thus became a microcosm of the Spanish Civil War, a conflict where ideology, foreign intervention, modern technology, and human resilience intertwined in a prolonged struggle with far-reaching consequences. For historians and military analysts, Brunete offered lessons in the complexities of coalition warfare, the limitations of offensive operations under resource constraints, and the enduring impact of war on civilian populations. By mid-1937, the Spanish Civil War had evolved into a conflict where aerial warfare was central to both strategy and psychological impact. The Nationalists, with substantial support from Germany's Luftwaffe and Italy's Aviazione Legionaria, expanded their bombing campaigns across Republican territories. Cities such as Valencia, Barcelona, and Bilbao were repeatedly targeted, with the intent of crippling infrastructure, disrupting supply lines, and breaking civilian morale. The Condor Legion, in particular, perfected techniques in precision bombing, dive bombing, and coordinated strikes with artillery and mechanized ground units. effectively transforming Spain into a testing ground for modern warfare. These operations had both tactical and psychological objectives. Beyond destroying military installations, the raids terrorized civilian populations, creating widespread panic and forcing the relocation of hospitals, schools, and essential services. Republicans responded with limited air defenses, utilizing Soviet-supplied aircraft, anti-aircraft artillery, and improvised early warning systems. Pilots and ground crews faced overwhelming odds, often engaging in nighttime patrols or intercept missions under harsh conditions. The intensification of aerial warfare also drew the attention of international observers, journalists, and humanitarian organizations who documented the human cost of bombings and the broader implications for 20th century conflict. The war became a grim demonstration of how technological advances, combined with political ideology, could target civilians as a strategic tool, foreshadowing the total warfare of World War II. While the air war dominated headlines, control of the seas played an equally crucial role in the Spanish Civil War. The nationalists leveraged the Spanish fleet and Italian naval support to establish dominance along the Mediterranean and Atlantic coasts. Key ports such as Bilbao, Santander, and Malaga fell under nationalist control, allowing Franco's forces to disrupt Republican shipping, limit access to foreign supplies, and secure vital maritime supply routes for troops, weaponry, and essential goods. Naval operations included blockades, convoy escorts, and amphibious support for ground offensives. Republican attempts to counter these maneuvers were hampered by limited naval resources, internal political disagreements, and non-intervention policies from international powers, which prevented significant external support. The struggle for control of the coast had far-reaching strategic consequences. It isolated Republican strongholds, hindered the transport of critical resources, and forced reliance on overland supply routes that were vulnerable to nationalist attacks. Additionally, naval dominance allowed nationalists to maintain lines of communication with Italy and Germany, ensuring steady logistical and technological support for ongoing campaigns. Civilians living in coastal regions faced direct impacts. Bombardments of port facilities, disruption of fishing and trade, and forced relocations all compounded the hardships caused by the ongoing war. The naval dimension of the conflict underscored the multifaceted nature of the Spanish Civil War, highlighting that control of the seas could decisively influence the outcome of campaigns and the sustainability of resistance efforts. As the war dragged on, the suffering of civilians prompted growing international concern and humanitarian intervention. Refugee crises emerged across Republican territories, particularly after heavy bombardments, sieges, and nationalist offensives. Thousands of families fled cities, seeking safety in rural areas or across borders into France and other neighboring countries. International relief efforts, organized by governments, religious organizations, and non-governmental organizations, sought to provide food, medical aid, and shelter. The Red Cross and other humanitarian groups played a crucial role in distributing supplies, establishing field hospitals, and coordinating evacuations of children and vulnerable populations. Spain's civilian plight attracted the attention of journalists, photographers, and writers who reported on atrocities, starvation, and the resilience of the people under siege. These reports influenced public opinion abroad, generating sympathy for Republican civilians while increasing pressure on neutral governments to respond. However, the effectiveness of humanitarian aid was limited by logistical constraints, ongoing hostilities, and a nationalist strategy of controlling territories to restrict access. Despite these challenges, international assistance provided critical relief, saving countless lives and highlighting the role of global civil society in responding to the human consequences of modern warfare. The interplay of military action, civilian suffering, and international humanitarian efforts underscored the complex nature of the Spanish Civil War, illustrating that the conflict extended far beyond the battlefield to encompass moral, political, and ethical dimensions that resonated worldwide. Following the fall of Bilbao in June 1937, the Republican Northern Front faced immense pressure as nationalist forces consolidated control over the Basque region. With Bilbao lost, Republican commanders shifted their focus to Santander, the next strategic urban and industrial center in northern Spain. Santander held critical importance for its port, which could facilitate supplies from the sea and sustain Republican defensive operations in the north. However, Republican forces were weakened by earlier losses, reduced morale, and the exhaustion of militias and international brigade volunteers who had endured the siege of Bilbao. Commanders faced the dual challenge of defending the city while preparing for potential evacuation routes should the situation deteriorate further. The defensive strategy involved fortifying urban positions, establishing strong points along key roads and river crossings, and coordinating limited artillery support to slow nationalist advances. Local militias, alongside regular army units and Basque forces, attempted to organize a coherent defense despite ideological divisions and logistical constraints. Nationalist forces, supported by Italian mechanized units and German air power, sought to encircle Santander, cutting off access to reinforcement and supply routes. The Republicans had to rely on ingenuity, local knowledge, and civilian support to maintain resistance. Civilians were mobilized to dig trenches, reinforce buildings, and transport supplies to frontline units. The defense of Santander became a testament to resilience under extreme adversity, illustrating that even in the face of overwhelming odds, coordination, determination, and knowledge of terrain could temporarily delay a superior force. The Battle of Santander, fought in August 1937, was a decisive confrontation that would determine the fate of northern Republican Spain. Nationalist forces launched a concentrated offensive, combining mechanized units, infantry, and artillery to rapidly break Republican defensive lines. The Luftwaffe and Italian air units conducted sustained bombing campaigns targeting both military positions and civilian infrastructure, creating chaos and fear within the city and its surroundings. Republican forces mounted fierce resistance, engaging in urban combat, ambushes, and counterattacks. Trench lines, barricades, and fortified positions slowed the nationalist advance, and the local militias, aided by international brigade members, demonstrated notable bravery and tactical ingenuity. Despite these efforts, nationalist superiority in equipment, organization, and air support proved overwhelming. By late August, the city had fallen and the Republican defense collapsed. The loss of Santander marked the complete nationalist control of the Basque and Cantabrian coasts, securing critical industrial resources and ports that would further strengthen Franco's war effort. The battle's intensity underscored the devastating human cost of modern warfare. Thousands of soldiers and civilians were killed or wounded, with entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. Hospitals and relief services were overwhelmed, and survivors were forced to flee into the surrounding countryside or seek refuge further south. The fall of Santander also had profound psychological effects on Republican forces and civilian populations, highlighting the challenges of sustaining prolonged resistance against a better equipped and coordinated enemy. The fall of Santander precipitated a mass evacuation from the remaining Republican-held areas in northern Spain, particularly Asturias. Thousands of civilians, alongside retreating Republican troops, fled southward or sought refuge along the northern coastline, facing treacherous terrain, limited supplies, and the threat of nationalist bombardment. Roads were congested with refugees, creating logistical nightmares for both military and humanitarian efforts. Families carried only what they could, leaving homes, belongings, and livelihoods behind, while soldiers struggled to maintain order and discipline amid the chaos. The retreat from Asturias was a desperate attempt to preserve remaining forces and protect civilians from the advancing nationalists. Refugees endured long marches, hunger, and exposure, with many succumbing to disease and exhaustion. Relief efforts, though organized by local committees and international aid groups, were insufficient to meet the overwhelming needs. The evacuation highlighted the intersection of military operations and humanitarian crisis, revealing the extent to which civilians were forced into the front lines of war. Despite this suffering, acts of solidarity emerged. Communities shared scarce resources, volunteers assisted the wounded, and local organizations improvised temporary shelters. The Asturias retreat became emblematic of the broader human toll of the Spanish Civil War, where territorial loss, military strategy, and civilian survival were inextricably linked. The fall of northern Spain underscored Franco's strategic advantage, while exposing the Republicans' vulnerabilities, setting the stage for intensified battles in central and eastern Spain, and solidifying the importance of international awareness and aid in mitigating the consequences of total war. By late 1937, the Republican forces shifted attention to the Ebro region, a strategically vital area that connected central and eastern Spain while offering potential for launching counteroffensives. The Ebro River and surrounding terrain provided natural defensive advantages, including river crossings, hills, and narrow valleys that could be fortified to resist superior nationalist forces. The Republican leadership recognized that holding the Ebro was critical to maintaining territorial integrity, protecting Valencia and Catalonia, and preventing nationalist consolidation of central Spain. Units stationed in the region included regular Republican Army divisions, local militias, and international brigade volunteers who brought experience, tactical training, and morale reinforcement. Defensive preparations involve constructing trenches, fortifying riverbanks, and deploying limited artillery to cover approaches, while reconnaissance teams monitored nationalist movements. The Republic also sought to maintain supply lines from central hubs, although these were often targeted by nationalist aircraft and artillery. The region's civilian population played a crucial role, assisting with logistics, constructing fortifications, and providing intelligence on enemy activity. While nationalist forces enjoyed advantages in air power, mechanized units, and coordinated artillery support, the Ebro's challenging terrain and Republican preparedness offered the potential to stall offensives and inflict casualties. The defense of this region became a microcosm of the broader war. The interplay of geography, logistics, civilian involvement, and tactical ingenuity shaping the conduct of modern conflict. Holding the Ebro required coordination between various factions within the Republican coalition, testing their ability to work together despite ideological differences, while maintaining morale under the constant threat of nationalist assault. The Battle of Teruel, beginning in December 1937, marked a critical and brutal winter campaign in the Spanish Civil War. The city of Teruel, located in Aragon, was strategically significant for both sides due to its position as a transportation hub and its potential to serve as a springboard for operations in the surrounding provinces. Republican forces launched a surprise winter offensive aimed at capturing the city and disrupting nationalist supply lines. Initial advances were successful, with Republican troops occupying key positions and demonstrating remarkable adaptability to harsh winter conditions, including snow, freezing temperatures, and rugged terrain. However, nationalist forces quickly organized counterattacks, employing mechanized units, artillery, and air support to reclaim lost ground. The battle devolved into a protracted struggle characterized by trench warfare, urban combat, and repeated assaults and counter-assaults. Both sides suffered immense casualties, with the civilian population trapped in the crossfire enduring severe hardships, including shortages of food, heating, and medical care. Hospitals were overwhelmed, and evacuation routes were limited due to ongoing combat and difficult terrain. The Battle of Teruel exemplified the evolution of modern warfare, where urban centers became fortified battle zones, air power influenced frontline dynamics, and the interplay of technology and human endurance shaped outcomes. While the Republicans initially demonstrated strategic initiative and resilience, the Nationalists ultimately regained control of Teruel in early 1938, underscoring the limitations imposed by logistical constraints, harsh weather, and the superior coordination of Franco's forces. The winter campaigns of 1937 to 1938, including the battles of Teruel and Ebro, highlighted both the intensity of the Spanish Civil War and the resilience of those involved. For Republican forces, winter conditions compounded logistical challenges. Frozen rivers, snow-blocked roads, and harsh weather made troop movements, supply delivery, and frontline rotations extremely difficult. Units suffered from frostbite, disease, and exposure, while soldiers faced dwindling ammunition and food supplies. Civilians living near the front lines endured similar hardships, improvising shelters, rationing food, and assisting militias despite constant bombardment. Nationalist forces, though better equipped, also faced challenges navigating difficult terrain and maintaining extended supply lines during winter operations. The winter campaigns had broader strategic and psychological consequences. For the Republic, the inability to hold Teruel permanently or advance beyond the Ebro reinforced the importance of coordination, supply, and foreign support. It also exposed the limitations of relying on ideologically diverse militias under extreme conditions. For the Nationalists, successful winter offensives demonstrated the advantages of mechanized units, coordinated air support, and superior logistical planning, bolstering morale and providing momentum for subsequent operations. The winter of 1937 to 1938 became emblematic of the Spanish Civil War's grueling nature, where technology, terrain, weather, and human endurance intersected to determine the outcomes of prolonged campaigns. It also reinforced the war's status as a testing ground for modern tactics, foreshadowing the mechanized, air-supported battles that would define the European theater in the coming global conflict. Civilians, soldiers, and commanders alike experienced the brutal reality that survival, strategy, and resilience were inextricably linked in the harsh winter of Spain. By the spring of 1938, Republican leaders recognized the urgent need to regain momentum after a series of losses, including the fall of Teruel and the northern provinces. The Ebro River, stretching across eastern Spain, became the focal point of a major Republican counteroffensive intended to disrupt nationalist advances, recapture territory, and boost morale among both soldiers and civilians. Planning for the offensive involved meticulous coordination of infantry, artillery, and limited armored units, alongside Soviet-supplied aircraft and logistical support. Republican forces, including regular army divisions, local militias, and international brigades, were mobilized and positioned along strategic crossing points of the Ebro River. Commanders focused on surprise, speed, and the integration of various ideological factions into a unified operational plan, despite persistent tensions between anarchists, socialists, and communist-aligned units. Intelligence gathering, reconnaissance, and detailed mapping of nationalist positions were critical components of preparation. Supplies, though limited, were stockpiled to sustain troops during the offensive, while temporary fortifications were constructed along the riverbanks and nearby hills to protect against counterattacks. Civilians played a key role in supporting logistics, building defensive positions, and providing vital information on enemy movements. The stage was set for one of the largest and most intense operations of the Spanish Civil War, where terrain, coordination, and human endurance would determine the outcome of a prolonged and pivotal battle. The Battle of the Ebro, which began in July 1938, marked the largest and bloodiest confrontation of the Spanish Civil War. Republican forces initiated a massive river crossing, catching the Nationalists by surprise and initially achieving significant territorial gains. Strategic towns, high ground, and road networks were temporarily captured, demonstrating the effectiveness of planning, coordination, and the valor of diverse Republican units. However, the Nationalists quickly mobilized reinforcements, employing superior artillery, mechanized units, and intensive air support from German and Italian forces to counter the advance. The battle evolved into a protracted and exhausting struggle, characterized by trench warfare, repeated assaults and counter-assaults, and relentless attrition. Conditions on the battlefield were harsh. Extreme heat during the day, limited access to clean water and food, and the constant threat of artillery and air attacks tested the endurance of soldiers and their commanders. Civilians caught in the conflict faced displacement, destruction of property, and exposure to disease, with many fleeing to safer regions further south. The international brigades played a prominent role, providing experienced combatants and serving as a symbolic representation of international solidarity against fascism. Despite the initial successes, Republican forces struggled to maintain momentum in the face of nationalist numerical superiority, air dominance, and logistical challenges. The Battle of the Ebro became a grueling test of endurance, strategy, and coordination, highlighting both the potential and limitations of the Republican military effort during this critical phase of the war. The Ebro campaign illustrated the evolution of tactical thinking in modern warfare. Republicans employed combined armed strategies, integrating infantry assaults with limited artillery barges and air support, while emphasizing rapid mobility and surprise crossings to maximize initial gains. Small unit tactics, trench construction, and the use of natural terrain for defensive advantage showcased ingenuity despite material limitations. Meanwhile, the Nationalists refined their defensive responses, coordinating mechanized units, artillery, and air power to counter Republican advances efficiently. The prolonged engagement resulted in staggering casualties on both sides, emphasizing the war's attritional nature. Strategically, the Battle of the Ebro had mixed results. While Republicans demonstrated the capacity to launch large-scale operations and temporarily seize territory, the inability to sustain the offensive ultimately allowed nationalists to regroup and consolidate gains. Politically, the battle underscored the challenges of maintaining coalition unity among diverse Republican factions, whose ideological divisions often hindered operational cohesion. Civilians bore the brunt of prolonged combat, with widespread displacement, destruction of infrastructure, and the disruption of agricultural production threatening survival in the Ebro Valley. International observers noted the intensity of the battle, the scale of human suffering, and the emergence of Spain as a laboratory for modern combined arms warfare. The campaign foreshadowed future conflicts in Europe, where prolonged battles, technological superiority, and attrition would play defining roles, while also demonstrating the resilience and determination of forces fighting under immense hardship. Following the grueling Republican effort at the Battle of the Ebro, nationalist forces seized the initiative, launching a series of counteroffensives aimed at reclaiming lost territory and pressuring remaining Republican strongholds. Franco's strategy was methodical, combining mechanized infantry, artillery barges, and concentrated airstrikes to systematically reduce Republican resistance. German and Italian support was pivotal. The Luftwaffe and Regia Aeronautica conducted targeted bombings on Republican positions, infrastructure, and key supply routes, while mechanized units facilitated rapid territorial advances. The counteroffensive exploited Republican weaknesses revealed during the Ebro campaign, particularly logistical limitations, factional divisions, and attrition among troops. Republican units, exhausted and undersupplied, struggled to mount effective defenses, often retreating under heavy pressure. The Nationalists advanced steadily, capturing towns and strategic road networks that allowed them to isolate Republican forces in eastern Spain. Civilians faced the immediate consequences of these offensives: mass displacement, destruction of homes, and interruption of essential services. Refugees fled towards central Spain and the French border, creating severe humanitarian challenges. The counteroffensive also marked a psychological shift, as the Nationalists demonstrated the inevitability of their advance, eroding the morale of both soldiers and civilians who had hoped for a Republican resurgence. Strategically, Franco aimed to divide and conquer, securing Catalonia, the industrial heart of Republican resistance, and cutting off the Republic from international support flowing through eastern ports. By late 1938 and early 1939, the Nationalist counteroffensive culminated in the fall of Catalonia, a catastrophic blow to the Republic. Cities such as Barcelona, Girona, and Tarragona fell in rapid succession, with Republican forces unable to mount cohesive defenses due to prior attrition, internal disunity, and resource scarcity. Barcelona, the cultural and industrial hub of Catalonia, faced relentless aerial bombardment and artillery shelling before falling into nationalist hands. Civilian evacuations became urgent, with tens of thousands fleeing toward the French border, often under dire conditions. Roads were congested with refugees carrying what few possessions they could save, while harsh winter conditions compounded suffering. The Nationalists, consolidating control over Catalonia, secured key industrial centers, ports, and communication networks essential for sustaining further military campaigns. The fall of Catalonia also had profound political implications. Republican governance collapsed in the region, while Franco established authoritarian administration and implemented strict measures to suppress resistance. Republican leaders faced the challenge of regrouping in central Spain, with the loss of Catalonia signaling the near-total collapse of organized opposition. The defeat demoralized troops and civilians alike, yet pockets of resistance continued to resist along isolated fronts, illustrating the persistent, albeit increasingly futile, determination of Republican forces. Catalonia's fall demonstrated the effectiveness of nationalist strategy, foreign support, and coordinated modern warfare, while highlighting the devastating consequences for civilian populations caught in the crossfire of total war. The fall of Catalonia precipitated one of the most severe humanitarian crises of the Spanish Civil War. Hundreds of thousands of civilians fled the advancing nationalist forces, seeking refuge in central Spain or across the French border. Refugee columns stretched for miles, with families exposed to harsh weather, inadequate food, and disease. Hospitals and relief operations were overwhelmed, struggling to provide care for the sick, wounded, and malnourished. International humanitarian organizations, including the Red Cross and various NGOs, attempted to provide assistance, but logistical constraints and the sheer scale of displacement limited the effectiveness of aid. Refugees faced additional hardships at border crossings, with overcrowded camps, insufficient sanitation, and exposure to violence or theft along the way. Despite these challenges, acts of solidarity emerged. Local communities shared resources, volunteers organized temporary shelters, and international observers documented the suffering to raise awareness abroad. The crisis highlighted the interplay between military strategy and civilian suffering, demonstrating that the consequences of territorial conquest extended far beyond immediate military gains. Politically, the fall of Catalonia sent shockwaves throughout Europe, drawing attention to the conflict's intensity and the vulnerability of civilians in modern warfare. Artists, journalists, and writers captured the human toll, ensuring that the experiences of refugees, soldiers, and families were recorded for posterity. The humanitarian catastrophe underscored the larger reality of the Spanish Civil War, a struggle where ideology, military strategy, foreign intervention, and human resilience intersected, leaving lasting scars on both the landscape and its people. As 1939 approached, Republican Spain was reduced to a few remaining strongholds, with Madrid standing as the symbolic and strategic center of resistance. The defense of Madrid had become both a military and psychological battleground, representing the Republic's last hope to maintain sovereignty and morale. Nationalist forces, now reinforced and better coordinated, pressed relentlessly toward the city, employing mechanized units, artillery, and air bombardments to weaken defenses. Republican commanders faced enormous challenges. Troops were exhausted from continuous campaigns, supplies were dwindling, and internal divisions between anarchists, communists, and socialist factions complicated decision-making. Despite these obstacles, the defenders of Madrid displayed remarkable resilience. Trenches, barricades, and fortified positions were established throughout the city, with militias and regular army units working to protect key neighborhoods, government buildings, and communication hubs. Civilian populations played a crucial role, assisting in fortification construction, transporting supplies, and providing intelligence on nationalist movements. The city endured repeated air raids, shelling, and street combat, highlighting the brutal realities of urban warfare. International observers, journalists, and volunteers documented the extraordinary courage and suffering of Madrid's defenders, bringing global attention to the ongoing conflict. Morale, though strained, was maintained through political messaging, community solidarity, and the symbolic importance of defending the Republic's capital. Yet, as the nationalists advanced, it became increasingly clear that Madrid's defense could only delay the inevitable rather than prevent it. While Madrid remained the central focus, Valencia served as the temporary capital of the Republic and a critical hub for political, military, and logistical coordination. Valencia's strategic importance stemmed from its coastal position, industrial capacity, and relative defensibility, allowing Republican leadership to maintain governance, organize military operations, and coordinate foreign aid. The city was also a sanctuary for civilians fleeing front lines in northern and eastern Spain, swelling its population and creating intense pressure on housing, food supply, and sanitation systems. Valencia's defense relied on a combination of regular army units, local militias, and international volunteers, but shortages of ammunition, medical supplies, and reinforcements increasingly undermined operational effectiveness. Nationalist forces employed aerial bombardments and artillery shelling to disrupt logistics, demoralize defenders, and weaken the city's ability to function as a military and political center. Despite these pressures, Valencia's citizens and defenders displayed extraordinary resilience. Shelters, hospitals, and supply distribution networks were improvised, while volunteers assisted in maintaining essential services and supporting military operations. The city became both a symbol of Republican perseverance and a testament to the broader humanitarian struggle caused by the war. As nationalist advances continued, the situation grew increasingly desperate, with leadership contemplating evacuation plans and strategies to prolong defense while minimizing civilian casualties. Valencia, like Madrid, embodied the intersection of military necessity, political authority, and civilian endurance in the final stages of Republican resistance. Amid the military pressures of 1938 to 1939, the Republican side was plagued by deep internal divisions that weakened both strategic coherence and morale. Ideological factions, including anarchists, socialists, and communists, often disagreed on military tactics, political priorities, and governance, undermining the ability to coordinate defenses and organize effective counteroffensives. Disputes over resource allocation, command authority, and international aid further exacerbated tensions, creating pockets of friction that nationalist forces could exploit. The presence of international brigades, while bolstering manpower and morale, occasionally heightened ideological friction as Soviet-influenced units clashed with local militias or anarchist commanders over operational decisions. Civilian morale was also affected as shortages of food, medicine, and basic necessities intensified, while the relentless bombardment of cities like Madrid and Valencia eroded hope. Political leaders faced difficult choices: maintain factional representation to preserve coalition unity, or centralize authority to enforce strategic decisions, often at the cost of internal dissent. The fragmentation of Republican forces revealed a critical vulnerability. While the nationalists were able to coordinate strategy, supply, and operations under Franco's centralized command, the Republic struggled to unify disparate factions under a coherent plan. This internal weakness, combined with the overwhelming material and logistical superiority of the nationalists, foreshadowed the eventual collapse of Republican resistance. Despite extraordinary courage, dedication, and resilience among soldiers and civilians, the combination of external pressures and internal discord created a situation where strategic defeat became increasingly inevitable. By early 1939, the Republican cause was on the verge of collapse. After the loss of Catalonia and ongoing defeats in the Ebro region, Republican forces were stretched thin, exhausted, and suffering from critical shortages of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Despite these overwhelming challenges, pockets of resistance remained in central Spain, particularly in Madrid and Valencia. The Republican leadership, including political and military commanders, faced difficult choices: continue fighting to preserve honor and morale, or negotiate terms to prevent further civilian suffering. Military operations in this period were largely defensive, aimed at delaying nationalist advances and protecting remaining civilian populations. Soldiers, militias, and international brigades, though diminished in number, displayed remarkable resilience, utilizing urban fortifications, barricades, and guerrilla tactics to defend key positions. Civilians actively participated in resistance efforts, organizing supply lines, reinforcing defensive positions, and maintaining communication networks despite constant bombardment. Meanwhile, nationalist forces, leveraging superior coordination, mechanized units, and air superiority, advanced steadily, applying relentless pressure on Republican positions. Psychological warfare became a factor as well. Propaganda emphasized the inevitability of nationalist victory, while Republicans sought to maintain morale through messages of solidarity and patriotic duty. The final months of resistance highlighted the tragic intersection of human courage, strategic desperation, and the harsh realities of total war, illustrating both the determination of those defending the Republic and the overwhelming forces aligned against them. Madrid, the symbolic heart of the Republic, ultimately fell to nationalist forces in March 1939, marking a decisive turning point in the war. The city, battered by months of aerial bombardments, artillery shelling, and urban combat, had been fortified to the maximum extent possible by Republican defenders. Despite extraordinary efforts by militias, regular army units, and international brigades, the nationalists employed relentless offensive tactics, concentrating artillery, mechanized divisions, and air attacks to break remaining defensive lines. Civilian populations, already weakened by shortages and displacement, faced catastrophic consequences. Homes were destroyed, food became scarce, and medical facilities were overwhelmed by casualties from both military engagements and indirect suffering caused by starvation and disease. The fall of Madrid had profound political implications. Republican government officials, recognizing the impossibility of continued organized resistance, fled the city, and Franco established control over the capital, imposing strict measures to secure the city politically and militarily. For soldiers and civilians, the event marked the culmination of years of struggle, fear, and sacrifice. International observers, journalists, and humanitarian organizations documented the devastation, highlighting the immense human cost of urban warfare in modern conflict. The capture of Madrid symbolized the near-total defeat of organized Republican forces, while also demonstrating the effectiveness of centralized nationalist strategy, foreign military support, and coordinated modern warfare techniques. Following the fall of Madrid and the collapse of other Republican strongholds, a massive exodus of civilians and defeated soldiers took place, with hundreds of thousands fleeing toward the French border. The refugee crisis was unprecedented. Families carried whatever possessions they could salvage, traversing difficult terrain under harsh winter and early spring conditions, often without adequate food, clothing, or shelter. Columns of refugees stretched for miles, facing disease, exhaustion, and the threat of attack from residual nationalist patrols. Humanitarian assistance was limited. Relief efforts by the Red Cross and other international organizations were quickly overwhelmed by the scale of the displacement. Temporary camps were established in southern France, yet conditions remained harsh, with overcrowding, poor sanitation, and inadequate medical care leading to further suffering. Soldiers, both regular and militia units, often fled alongside civilians, attempting to regroup or survive, while international brigade members faced internment or repatriation under complex political arrangements. The mass exodus underscored the devastating consequences of total warfare on civilian populations, highlighting the intersection of military defeat, political collapse, and human suffering. The event left lasting scars on those who survived, shaping post-war memories, political narratives, and international awareness of the war's humanitarian toll. For historians, the flight into France exemplifies the tragic human dimension of civil war, where ideology, strategy, and military victory or defeat are inseparable from the immense suffering endured by ordinary people caught in the maelstrom. Following the military collapse of Republican forces in early 1939, Francisco Franco embarked on a systematic consolidation of power across Spain. With Madrid, Catalonia, and the northern provinces firmly under nationalist control, Franco moved quickly to secure political authority, establish centralized governance, and integrate the military, administrative, and civil institutions under his command. This process involved the dissolution of Republican institutions, the suppression of local councils and autonomous governance structures, and the establishment of loyalist administrations tasked with enforcing nationalist policies. Military units were redeployed across former Republican territories to maintain order, prevent insurrections, and secure strategic infrastructure such as railways, ports, and industrial centers. Franco relied heavily on a hierarchical and disciplined military structure, combining career officers, nationalist militias, and foreign-trained units to enforce control efficiently. The consolidation of power also involved meticulous political management. Franco integrated conservative, monarchist, and fascist factions into a single ruling coalition under his leadership, ensuring loyalty through appointments, propaganda, and the strategic use of fear. The Catholic Church played a pivotal role in legitimizing nationalist authority, providing moral sanction for Franco's rule, and helping to implement social and educational reforms that reinforced regime ideology. By carefully controlling both military and civilian structures, Franco transformed nationalist victory from a battlefield success into a durable political reality, laying the foundation for decades of authoritarian governance. The nationalist victory in April 1939 officially ended the Spanish Civil War, marking a profound turning point in Spain's political and social landscape. Franco's triumph represented not only a military success, but also a total ideological victory over the Republicans, whose defeat symbolized the collapse of democratic, socialist, and anarchist movements within Spain. Across the country, nationalist forces occupied former Republican strongholds, imposing martial law, conducting mass arrests of suspected opposition members, and confiscating property deemed supportive of the Republic. The immediate effect on civilians was severe. Thousands were executed, imprisoned, or forced into labor camps. Families were displaced, and communities that had resisted nationalist authority faced systematic reprisal. Economic infrastructure, already weakened by years of war, required extensive reconstruction, yet resources were concentrated in service of consolidating regime control. Internationally, the victory signaled the establishment of a stable fascist-aligned regime in Spain, creating a diplomatic environment that discouraged interference from democratic powers and strengthened Franco's ties with Germany and Italy, who had supported his military efforts. The victory also sent a clear message regarding the dangers of ideological fragmentation and the consequences of civil conflict, influencing political movements and military planning across Europe. For ordinary Spaniards, the nationalist victory meant a dramatic reshaping of daily life. Strict censorship, social conformity, and adherence to the regime's political, religious, and cultural mandates became unavoidable. In the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, Franco's regime initiated a campaign of post-war repression designed to eliminate remaining Republican influence, suppress dissent, and instill fear throughout society. Courts-martial, tribunals, and summary executions targeted former Republican officials, militia leaders, intellectuals, and civilians accused of opposition. Many were imprisoned in overcrowded facilities or sent to forced labor camps, where harsh conditions, malnutrition, and disease were rampant. Public executions served as both punishment and deterrent, reinforcing regime authority and signaling that opposition would not be tolerated. The repression extended beyond political targets to include cultural, educational, and social spheres. Republican schools were closed or reoriented to promote nationalist ideology. Publications were censored, and artistic expression was restricted to content aligned with the regime. Religious institutions, particularly the Catholic Church, collaborated with the state to enforce moral and ideological conformity, often participating in the identification and punishment of perceived dissidents. The psychological impact on the population was profound. Fear, mistrust, and trauma became widespread, affecting families, communities, and entire regions. Despite these harsh measures, pockets of resistance persisted clandestinely, with underground Republican networks and international sympathizers continuing to oppose Franco's rule through covert actions, propaganda, and support for refugees abroad. The early post-war repression demonstrated the regime's determination to consolidate absolute power, the systematic elimination of opposition, and the use of fear as a tool to stabilize control over a nation devastated by years of civil conflict. The Spanish Civil War left enduring scars on the nation, reshaping politics, society, and culture for decades. Politically, Franco's authoritarian regime eliminated democratic institutions and established a centralized, hierarchical state dominated by the military, conservative elites, and the Catholic Church. Republican parties, trade unions, and anarchist organizations were banned, and political dissent was ruthlessly suppressed. Spain experienced a dramatic reduction in civil liberties. Freedom of speech, assembly, and press were curtailed, and the regime imposed strict censorship on literature, art, and education to promote nationalist ideology. Socially, families and communities were fractured. Thousands of civilians have been killed, displaced, or imprisoned, leaving generational trauma and deep resentment in affected regions. Economic reconstruction was slow, as much of the industrial and agricultural infrastructure had been destroyed during the war. Land reforms and social programs implemented by Republican governments were reversed, concentrating property ownership in the hands of conservative elites and exacerbating inequalities. Education and cultural life were reshaped to reflect nationalist ideals, suppressing regional languages and cultural identities such as Catalan, Basque, and Galician. The psychological impact of the war lingered, with fear and mistrust permeating society and an enduring divide between supporters of the Republic and nationalists shaping interpersonal relationships and community dynamics. The war's legacy influenced political behavior for decades, shaping the experiences of generations raised under Franco's authoritarian rule and leaving Spain deeply divided well into the late 20th century. The Spanish Civil War drew the attention of the international community, both during the conflict and in its aftermath. Initially, the war served as a proxy battleground for competing ideologies. Fascism, communism, and democracy collided on Spanish soil. Hitler and Mussolini's support for Franco demonstrated the strategic value of Spain as a laboratory for modern warfare, including the testing of advanced aircraft, artillery, and combined arms tactics. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union provided limited support to Republican forces, both military and ideological, highlighting the global polarization of the 1930s. Western democracies, particularly Britain and France, largely adhered to non-intervention policies, limiting their assistance to refugees or humanitarian aid while avoiding direct military involvement. The fall of the Republic and Franco's rise to power were met with concern among democratic nations, but were largely tolerated diplomatically, as Europe moved toward the inevitability of global conflict. Spain's experience influenced military thinking, with the effectiveness of air power, mechanized units, and propaganda studied by observers who would later engage in World War II. Humanitarian crises, refugee flows, and the persecution of civilians also drew international attention, shaping the development of early 20th century humanitarian interventions and influencing post-war refugee policies. Spain's civil war thus had profound geopolitical implications, signaling the rise of fascist-aligned regimes, the failures of international non-intervention, and the dangers of ideological extremism in a world on the brink of global war. The legacy of Franco's regime persisted for nearly 4 decades, leaving an indelible mark on Spain's political, social, and cultural life. Franco ruled with absolute authority, maintaining political stability through repression, censorship, and control of military and civil institutions. Economic development under his rule was uneven, with initial autarkic policies followed by gradual modernization in the 1950s and 1960s, but always under centralized state control. Cultural memory of the Civil War remained contested. Public discussion of the conflict, Republican resistance, and atrocities committed by both sides was heavily restricted. Families of victims faced silence, censorship, and social pressure, contributing to what historians refer to as a pact of forgetting that delayed reconciliation for decades. Nevertheless, the Civil War remained a defining historical reference point for understanding Spanish politics, regional identity, and the consequences of ideological polarization. The international artistic and intellectual response to the war, including Pablo Picasso's Guernica, literature, and journalism, ensured that global memory of the conflict persisted despite domestic suppression. Franco's victory and subsequent rule demonstrated the enduring impact of civil wars on national identity, political structures, and societal trauma. Even after the transition to democracy following Franco's death in 1975, Spain grappled with the legacy of repression, polarization, and historical memory, illustrating that the consequences of the Spanish Civil War extended far beyond the battlefield, shaping the nation's trajectory for generations. The Spanish Civil War, fought between 1936 and 1939, stands as one of the most significant conflicts of the 20th century, not only for Spain, but for the international community. Its historical importance lies in multiple dimensions: ideological, military, political, and humanitarian. Ideologically, it represented the clash between fascism, authoritarianism, and conservative nationalism on one side, and democracy, socialism, and anarchism on the other. The war became a proxy battlefield for broader European tensions, providing both fascist and communist powers with opportunities to test strategies, weapons, and alliances in preparation for the looming World War II. Militarily, the conflict served as a testing ground for modern warfare. Mechanized units, air power, coordinated artillery, and urban combat strategies were deployed and refined, foreshadowing the total war tactics of the subsequent global conflict. Politically, the collapse of the Spanish Republic demonstrated the vulnerability of fragmented coalitions in the face of well-organized, centralized forces. The war also highlighted the failures of international non-intervention policies, as Western democracies, despite awareness of atrocities and human suffering, chose to remain largely passive, allowing the conflict to escalate without meaningful external checks. For Spanish society, the historical significance is equally profound. The war caused immense human suffering, displaced millions, and left deep societal divisions that persisted for decades. It reshaped governance, cultural life, education, and regional identities, leaving a legacy of trauma, memory, and cautionary lessons about the consequences of ideological polarization. The Spanish Civil War provides numerous lessons that remain relevant for both military strategy and humanitarian considerations. One key lesson is the importance of unity and coordination in politically and ideologically diverse movements. The Republican side, despite significant talent, dedication, and international support, suffered from internal divisions between anarchists, socialists, and communists. These fractures weakened military operations, complicated strategic planning, and hindered efforts to maintain civilian morale. In contrast, the nationalists under Franco demonstrated the advantages of centralized command, coordination between military and political structures, and effective use of foreign support. Another lesson concerns the evolving nature of warfare. The conflict showcased the devastating effects of modern air power, mechanized units, urban combat, and artillery on both soldiers and civilians. The deliberate targeting of infrastructure and cities, coupled with psychological warfare, demonstrated that modern conflicts are total in nature, affecting entire societies rather than just battlefronts. Humanitarian lessons were equally stark. Millions of civilians were displaced, starving, and exposed to disease and violence, highlighting the critical need for organized, international humanitarian intervention. Furthermore, the conflict revealed how propaganda, media, and art could influence public opinion and international perception, shaping both wartime morale and post-war memory. The war's lessons underscore that military victories alone are insufficient if political cohesion, civilian protection, and moral legitimacy are neglected, and they offer enduring insights into the complexities of civil conflict. The Spanish Civil War's impact extends far beyond Spain, influencing Europe and the broader modern world. Militarily, tactics and technologies tested in Spain informed strategies used in World War II, including the coordination of mechanized units, combined arms operations, and the use of strategic aerial bombardment. Politically, the war served as a warning about the dangers of ideological extremism, polarization, and international inaction, demonstrating how civil conflicts can quickly escalate into regional and global crises. Culturally, the war inspired artists, writers, and intellectuals worldwide, producing works like Picasso's Guernica, which captured the human suffering caused by aerial bombardment and total warfare. The mass displacement of civilians created a refugee crisis that shaped post-war humanitarian policy and international law, setting precedents for addressing the consequences of war on civilian populations. Additionally, the war left an enduring legacy on Spain's national identity. Regional languages, political ideologies, and cultural traditions were suppressed under Franco's authoritarian regime, and the subsequent transition to democracy required decades of reconciliation and negotiation. Globally, the conflict remains a powerful case study in the interplay between ideology, foreign intervention, military strategy, and human cost. Its lessons continue to inform policymakers, historians, and military strategists about the dangers of internal division, the responsibilities of the international community, and the resilience of human societies in the face of extreme adversity. The Spanish Civil War stands as a defining moment in 20th century history, a profound reminder of the cost of conflict, and a touchstone for understanding the trajectory of Europe leading into the cataclysm of World War II. And that concludes our journey through the Spanish Civil War, a conflict that forever changed Spain and offered profound lessons for the world. Today, we've explored how ideological divides can tear nations apart, how courage and resilience shine even in the darkest times, and how the choices of leaders and civilians alike shape history's outcome. From the battles of Madrid and the Ebro to the mass exodus of refugees and Franco's rise to power, we've seen both the tragedy and the human spirit that endured. The moral of the story is clear. Unity, foresight, and compassion can influence the course of history, while division and extremism can bring nations to the brink of destruction. As we reflect on these events, let's remember the people whose lives were forever altered and the lessons that remain relevant today. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to History Teller YT so you never miss a journey into the past. Join us next time as we uncover more stories, bring history to life, and explore the moments that shaped our world. Thank you for listening, and we can't wait to take you on the next adventure.